Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending the webinar today, December 10th, 2019, on a unique issue, at least I think, managing motor vehicle accidents in the workplace. I've never done one like this. Denise, have you ever done one like this?
No.
No. So this is interesting. There's a lot of good material we are going to cover today. The man behind the voice you're hearing is Carl Habekost. I'm an attorney at Bugbee Conkle. I have certifications in safety as well as workers' compensation. And with me today is Denise Honsberger. Denise, you want to tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
I'm a workers' compensation rep. I've been doing this for over 20 years. I've worked in the fields of manufacturing, healthcare, and now in the construction industry. I have my occupational safety certificate and also a SHRM SP, so I'm glad to be here.
So you have certifications in both safety and human resources.
Yes.
Very good. Well, here's what we're going to cover today in 60 minutes. Basically, how do you handle a motor vehicle accident investigation? What are some good practices for that? Is workers' compensation an issue in an auto accident? And if so, how do you manage the claims? What do you do for investigation? Does OSHA come into play, the Occupational Safety and Health Act? Are there OSHA regulations that apply to motor vehicle accidents? What kind of human resource policies and procedures should you have in effect? And how should you implement those procedures anytime you have a motor vehicle accident? What kind of insurance policy considerations should we be focused on? Is there an opportunity for the company to get some money back, so to speak, due to an auto accident? And let's move forward.
All right, when we did this webinar, we thought we'd start with a scenario so you kind of have some context behind what we're going to talk about today. In my different roles, I've had to deal with motor vehicle accidents from a workers' comp standpoint and a safety standpoint, and this might be an example of a scenario that you would come across. So let's picture our employee Mike driving a company vehicle, and he's going from an main office to his job site. He's traveling on a public road, and he rear ends a third-party vehicle as he approaches a stop sign. The airbags deploy. Damages are reported to both the company vehicle as well as the third-party vehicle. Minor injuries to both parties are reported, so they're taken by ambulance to the hospital, treated and released, and the employee is cited for causing the accident. And also the vehicles are towed to the shop for repairs.
Hey, Denise, just real quick, and I know a lot of the people who have registered and are in attendance today, they know a lot about this. But you mentioned third party. What did you mean by third party?
So a third party, if you are coming up to a stop sign and there's an unknown vehicle in front of you, so it's not another company vehicle, it's not another employee, just a member of the general public, and you rear end somebody that you don't know. So it could also be another employee if it happened on a job site. So it doesn't necessarily mean somebody you don't know, but it's not the person who caused the accident or who's filing the report.
All right, thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So obviously if this happens, first things first, you need to think about who you need to report this to, calling 911, getting medical care to the scene, all of those things. You also want to make sure that as soon as possible, you're notifying your supervisor, your safety department, whatever your protocols talk about, who needs to know that you've been in this accident. And then really important is to secure the scene. If you are on a very busy highway, you might be reluctant to secure the scene and go forward with the steps we're going to talk about, but leaving the site and exchanging insurance information only isn't necessarily the best practice, but you definitely want to make sure you've got hazards on and all those things to safely secure your area. So once you start your investigation, you want to complete your company incident report. So I'm going to start from a company perspective. Most companies have an investigation process that they're going to go through, and it starts with completing a report. This is important because it's going to provide the details to all the parties that need to know what's going on. It's going to tell you the who, the what, the when, the where, and the why. And that will basically allow for that accident investigation to start. There are repercussions if you don't do this, because that is one party's eye on what happened, and it provides information that an insurance carrier is going to need, or a workers' comp rep, and you want to document those things while it's fresh in your mind. So going on from here, you want to think about who should be preparing the incident reports and conducting the investigation. Obviously, if you have employees that are involved in the accident, you want them to complete reports. They might have a coworker in the vehicle with them. So any witnesses to the accident, whether it's a stranger who saw the accident happen on the street or somebody in your vehicle, it's important to do that. Conducting the investigation as well, your supervisor should be reviewing the incident reports and making sure they understand what happened and that they're looking at it from a company perspective. They might have information regarding personal problems or something that might have happened on the scene that other people wouldn't know. And an example of that might be the employee says, yes, this is what happened, but what wasn't in the report the employee filed was that he had been on the phone, texting, and not paying attention when the accident happened. So those other details could be important. You might also have some professionals looking at your accident investigation, whether it be third parties coming in to do photos or photo recreations of a scene, or looking at the different reports. You also would have your safety or workers' comp specialist. They might be looking at that to understand the process and the safety requirements that might have been violated. And after an accident happens, you might even get private investigators to involve. If your employee says after the accident they can't work for 2 months and they're off work, you might want to use some private investigation or do some background checks.
So we have supervisors, professionals, and maybe even private investigators do the investigation. Is there a job classification or a type of person who should not do the investigation from your viewpoint?
I don't know that they should always not do it, but you want to be cautious. For example, if the supervisor is a husband or wife, that might be somebody that is not your best choice.
Because they're not real objective.
That's correct. Yeah. Right. Or supervisors that maybe they don't like the person and they're providing a report that's full of opinions versus reiterating the facts.
Exactly.
So you want to keep those types of things in mind.
Very good. Well, what should be on the incident report? So we've had an accident and somebody's doing an investigation. Let's just say that the supervisor is doing the investigation. And the supervisor also has a lot of stress and pressure on him or her to get the job done, whatever it is they may be doing. Maybe they're building a building or in sales or, trying to get a pipeline laid. And in the meantime, they're doing this investigation. What we always like to tell people is, remember, this document that you're preparing could be looked at 2 years down the road, 3 years down the road. And it could be a judge, a jury, or another attorney looking at that document.
Right, the basis of the investigation.
Yes, so this is very important. And there was an old TV show called Dragnet.
Hmm.
And the guy would always, eventually, at some point during the program, say, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts.
Yep.
And that's what we're looking for on these investigation reports. Dates, times, exact locations. You know, photographs are always a good way to document the scene. I know we're going to talk about that in a little bit. And what happened? Like you said, the supervisor, maybe eventually through talking to the driver, found out that the driver was texting his boss and wasn't paying attention and slammed into the car sitting in front of him. So that type of information is critical. It's very important from my perspective as a lawyer reading these things down the road that the supervisor or whoever's doing the investigation write things like the driver said, you know, the weather was bad and I couldn't see. Not that stated as a fact. Yes, not that the weather was bad and you ran into somebody, but the driver said or the driver alleged. So get written statements from everybody. More information is better than less.
And what I've seen oftentimes is, when I'm talking to employees, I will ask, well, where's your report? And did you file a police report or did you file a report? And they'll say, no, they said they'd do it and would send it to me. You never want to leave it to chance and leave somebody else to write down those facts. You want to make sure you're writing down the facts immediately so that they're accurate, and if there are any inconsistencies later, you'll be able to
absolutely
see that.
In fact, even in your own personal vehicle, you
absolutely.
should have, you should do your own investigation. Don't leave it to the police or somebody else to do it.
Yep. And I think when we talk about, you mentioned photos as a good way to document and have pictures related to the accident. It's important because
words, right?
You're
Did
right.
I just take that out of you were getting ready to say that, weren't you?
I was, but that's okay. So that's exactly true, because you can write down on your incident report that there was damage to the front end of my vehicle. The third party vehicle had damage to the rear end, but that doesn't really tell me what kind of damage that is. And a very good example I've run across, I had that exact same scenario happen to an employee, and when I called to get all of the specific facts, he said, yeah, there was really not much damage. My bumper was a little scratched. His bumper was a little bit scratched. So a few weeks later, we hear from an attorney for that third party, and they're alleging that the whole back end was smashed in, the quarter panel's damaged, it was undrivable now, tires damaged, and that it was a red Camry. And my guy's like, no, that's not what I hit. I hit a silver Accord.
Oh.
It was not documented anywhere as in that incident report. They didn't call the police because they were in a busy, congested area. They thought they would just exchange information. And then my company had to pay those claims because we did not have any proof otherwise. So that's something that's really important to think about. Having those photos and those videos, you can show, yes, it was not this kind of vehicle, it was this kind of vehicle, this is the actual damage, or you might take a picture showing no damage.
No damage, right.
Just as important.
And you know, in today's world, almost everyone has a cell phone with the ability to take pictures.
And if not, keep a disposable camera in your car and have that information, or, take those pictures.
And by the way, when you take a picture, you want to be able to make sure that you can document it was taken on a certain date.
Good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it doesn't look like it could have resulted from some other event.
So it wasn't
Yep.
fabricated.
Yep, very good.
Well, we have a police report. I don't know if you've seen, Denise, police reports after an auto accident. Sometimes they don't make any sense.
You're right. And a lot of times they are very good. They contain at least the information you need from an investigation standpoint, or the information your insurance carrier is going to need. It's going to tell the date, the time, what information was reported. They'll typically do a sketch of the scene to kind of give a bird's eye view as to what happened, but there can be inaccuracies. They might not have the driver's information right. I was in a motor vehicle accident, and they had somebody else's name as the third party, but I knew that wasn't it. They had taken a witness and put them as the driver. So there can be issues, and again, that goes back to that documentation, why you want to make sure you've got the information as well, so that if something is inaccurate, you can explain that.
Absolutely, and even the citations. We can dispute the citations if we've done our own investigation, taken our own pictures. I've seen police reports that will cite our client, for example, an employee of one of our clients, and it was clearly the third party's fault. They turned right in front of our driver.
Right.
So as we were able to dispute the citations in the police report because we did our own investigation.
Yep.
Yeah.
So some other things to think about, Carl's already touched on, you know, who should complete the investigation or conduct the investigation, but when do you start that investigation? As we've talked about, I think it's important to really start it at the moment that motor vehicle accident happens. You don't want to wait a week or two until you find out that somebody has contacted an insurance company or a lawyer to start that investigation. And you want to make sure you're asking the appropriate questions. You know, who's involved? What might be our exposure? You know, if everybody's injured, then you're going to need to know maybe what medical care they had. Am I going to need medical releases? So those are things you need to think about as you're going through the investigation. And then also, who should you interview? You want to make sure you're interviewing those witnesses. You're interviewing the driver, and you're interviewing that third party or anybody that might be involved. I think what not to do, you want to make sure you're not pointing fingers, you're not getting aggressive as you're trying to get the facts. Just do your best to get only the facts and document that.
Right.
So this kind of then segues into workers' compensation. In our example, our driver was a company employee. So he's injured, he went to the hospital, so the hospital or the employee is going to file a workers' compensation claim. And some people say, well, it was a motor vehicle accident. Why is it workers' compensation? If he was driving in the course and scope of employment and he's injured, he can file a workers' compensation claim. And in Ohio, it doesn't really matter whether he was at fault or if somebody else was at fault. They can file a claim regardless of fault.
Yep, so negligence, even negligence doesn't matter as far as workers' comp is concerned. Okay.
Right.
What else before we move on to the next slide? Workers' comp.
And I think, to your point, Carl, with negligence, that would be true unless there's the caveat with drugs and alcohol.
Yes.
So you're going to talk about that next.
I am. Well, yeah, drugs and alcohol. Going to start with this thing that we have to deal with now in Ohio called cannabis, otherwise known as marijuana. And there are a lot of considerations when we get to drugs and alcohol, but I want to throw out cannabis first. We have in Ohio a new law, relatively new law, that authorizes the use of medical marijuana. It's a very restrictive law, and employers can still take employment action against employees for violating their drug policy, even if the person is legally using medical marijuana. So the question comes about then, do companies have automatic post-accident drug tests after an auto accident? Now, maybe not after every work accident, every workplace accident. Some companies still do.
Right.
But what do you think, Denise, in your experience? You've worked in different industries. Do companies have automatic post-accident drug testing, alcohol testing?
I think it depends on the company and the size. Some smaller companies, they may not have a very robust handbook. They may not have a robust policy to do this. But I think in larger organizations or organizations like manufacturing or construction, a lot of their contracts, you have to show that you have a drug and alcohol policy.
Okay.
The important thing is, if you have one, to make sure you're applying it consistently. If you're only drug testing the people you don't like, or you're only drug testing the people that have a motor vehicle accident, you know, after work hours and not during work hours, you're not applying it consistent. And I think that's the most important thing. An insurance carrier is going to ask if one was done and is it negative or positive. Obviously, that can make a difference whether you're looking at workers' compensation, whether you have insurance coverage, but either way, consistency, in my opinion,
all right,
is the most important thing.
Fair enough. Now, let's say that you're a trucking company and you have employees who drive across, you know, across different states. So
right.
They're driving across country and they're hauling loads and they get tired.
Right.
There are studies that show that fatigue is as dangerous or more dangerous than being impaired due to drugs and alcohol. So do companies have policies about exceeding the drive time?
And I know
I'm putting you on the spot.
No,
this is unrehearsed.
And I do know through personal experience with trucking companies and, you know, having family as truck drivers, they do have logs that show they can only drive so many hours and then they're required to take a break. And it was not like that in the past.
Exactly.
But that same issue is just as relevant if you're in a manufacturing environment and you're working 14-hour shifts. It still goes back to what is the best scenario for keeping our employees safe, and having those long work shifts or those long drives will affect somebody's fatigue level and can make them more unsafe.
Sure. Okay, so drugs and alcohol, we know that somebody should not be driving while they're impaired, and that should be in every employer's policy somewhere. We also know that especially if you're in the trucking industry or any type of industry where you have people driving quite a bit, you should have some policy that limits their driving when they get fatigued. But there's also the issue in today's world of distracted driving.
Right.
The real problem with distracted driving is, of course, texting. So you want to have a policy against texting. You want to have a policy against electronic communication, doing emails and that. But studies also have shown that even using a Bluetooth phone, you're distracted. Maybe you're trying to punch in phone numbers while you're driving.
Smoking while you're driving.
Smoking while you're driving.
Eating while you're driving.
And you know what? I had a case that we defended, a pretty significant case with the truck driver who ended up having an accident because he dropped part of his sandwich and leaned over to get the sandwich, the remainder of the sandwich, on the far side of the passenger seat, and the truck went off the side of the road and he rolled the truck.
I have seen similar cases in the past, so you're right. It's not unusual, sadly.
So that includes a distracted driving issue. So everybody should have a distracted driving policy, which includes anti-texting, anti-emailing, anti-use of cell phones.
Right. Now, what if Carl, in your opinion, a third party is impaired. So maybe in this situation, our guy hits a third party, but the third party driver, the guy in front of him, stopped at the stop sign, had been sitting there because he was impaired.
Yeah.
He was smashed, exactly. So how does that play into our scenario?
In the fact that he's just sitting there without even brake lights on.
Do you
right?
think it affects where the workers' compensation claim?
No. No, workers' compensation claim is compensable as long as the injury occurred in the course of employment and arising out of employment. So if this individual was doing what they're supposed to be doing, in other words, they're driving and they haven't detoured to do a personal errand, they're just driving and doing their job, then that's a good claim, even if the third party was sitting there with no brake lights.
And does it make the employer not responsible for the accident then?
The employer is responsible for the accident, correct?
So just because that third party is impaired doesn't mean as a company you're still not going to be responsible for that motor vehicle accident.
That is correct. And we will get into perhaps how you as the employer can get some money back on that if the third party was responsible for the accident. But
wrap up workers' compensation. The other couple things you want to think about are looking beyond the incident. So if somebody alleges an incident, like in this case, they went to the hospital and they got medical care, you don't want to just assume, well, it's one medical bill, we'll pay it and we'll be done. You still want to look at the nature of the alleged medical conditions. Maybe he goes to the hospital, what in your mind should be for a contusion or a sprain, and all of a sudden they're asking for herniated discs and degenerative conditions. So look at their age, the mechanism of injuries, those medical conditions, and take that big picture approach.
yeah, and you know, before we move from this slide, and we will move more quickly, but the point that is not noticed on the prior slide or even this slide is the reason for doing a drug test is that, or alcohol test, is that if the accident can be proven to be caused by impairment of your employee, then you can defend the claim because it didn't arise out of employment. It arose out of the fact that the employee was impaired. We can have a whole webinar on that. I just wanted the audience to be aware of the importance of doing post-accident drug tests. Okay. So that is what kind of reminded me when you said look beyond the incident.
So this slide here talks about some other considerations, you know, thinking about the employee attendance or discipline issues. I'm sure you can think of cases where the day an employee is terminated, they filed workers' compensation claims. In our example, that isn't the case, but it's something to be aware of. But I can't stress enough, if you have a situation like this, make sure you get your third party and your attorneys involved sooner rather than later. You might think it's a cut and dry case, but at least if you run it by them, they can provide you with some insights and make sure, hey, did you think about this? Or let's get this information now. That's really important because once the claims have been filed and you've been contacted by other attorneys or insurance companies, you might have missed some important steps and a lot of time could have gone by.
Sure, you have to do what I call due diligence.
Exactly.
Yep. Well, we have talked about getting money back a couple of times, and I like the way you always bring up when we talk together, Denise, the who, what, when, where, why. Because that, if you're answering those questions when you're doing an investigation, you are going to get most of the information you'll need 2 years down the road when you're defending it in a lawsuit. So what is subrogation? What do we mean by subrogation? In Ohio, we have a statutory right for the employer, especially a self-insured employer, And if you're not self-insured, then the Bureau of Workers' Compensation will step in on your behalf to file for subrogation. And what does that mean? That means that the self-insured employer or the Bureau of Workers' Compensation can get money from the wrongdoer. That's the third party who caused the accident.
So for example, if this accident where the scenario was a little bit different and we were the one rear-ended, the company might have to pay for repair of the damages and might have to pay his workers' compensation claim, but then you can go back to that person who hit us and get money from their insurance carrier to reimburse us for what we have paid.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. It's that simple in a nutshell. So doing a proper investigation allows the company to compile evidence to support the fact or your argument that that third party was the cause of the accident, and therefore they should reimburse you for costs for lost time, for, you know, surgeries, for damage to the automobile.
And if you don't know the who and you don't know who hit you,
Right.
then you're not going to be able to subrogate. So it really protects the employee's interest as well as the company's interest.
Right. OSHA consideration.
Favorite topic.
Yes. Do you want to talk about this? You know, it's my picture up there, but you can talk if you want.
So I think when it comes to motor vehicle accidents, not only are you going to be thinking about workers' compensation, but you're going to be thinking about OSHA. Nobody wants to have more OSHA recordables, you know, assessed to their company than you really have. So go back to what that basic requirement is. And did that event or this motor vehicle happen while in the course and scope of employment? The work environment would be any establishment or location where the employees are present, whether they're, you know, working, but there is an exclusion, and that is commuting to or from work.
Correct.
So in our example, he was commuting from the home office to another job site. So that would be a consideration versus somebody who was on their way to work from home.
Right.
Right?
Yes. So, for example, salespeople, if they're driving to a customer to visit, make a customer visit or make a sale, and they're involved in an auto accident, that is an OSHA recordable. And why would you say that's an OSHA recordable? The argument is, well, shoot, they weren't in the work establishment, they weren't on the property of the company, but they were there. The injury occurred while they were doing their job.
Right.
So they wouldn't have been driving on that road at that time if it wasn't for the fact they were working for the employer. So I know it sounds weird, but they were present as a condition of their employment, and that's the key words. Mm-hmm. Present as a condition of their employment. So that's why somebody can be injured while driving on a public road, and that would be an OSHA recordable. Now, as you said, there are exceptions, and everybody goes, well, geez, I got ran over in the parking lot, and why isn't that an OSHA recordable? Well, because you were commuting. You had already clocked out. Now, this is a good one. This is a real subtle test. You had clocked out. You were going to your car. You're actually you're commuting at that point. But you're hit in the parking lot. That also is a workers' comp injury.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's investigation is important. And I think the slide that's up there right now, it's right from the OSHA website.
Oh, we switched slides. I didn't even notice.
And this is a very easy decision tree to help you decide whether that event is OSHA recordable or not. It's always out on the OSHA website. You might find it in a lot of the different seminars that you go to, but very easy to just say yes or no. Is it recordable or not recordable? So I know Carl's talking about OSHA recordables, but it's important to think about the criteria for the OSHA recordables and realizing that that criteria is different than workers' comp criteria.
Correct.
They are not the same.
They are not the same. And actually, that little example that just popped into my head exemplifies that very clearly. The person would have a workers' comp claim, but it's not a OSHA recordable.
Right.
Normally, it would, a lot of times it's the other way around because OSHA recording is pretty liberal compared to whether or not it would be a workers' comp claim. But we wanted to emphasize to you that OSHA recordable, or the recording of an OSHA incident, is not the same as reporting. So there are certain instances when an employer has to actually call in and report an incident to OSHA. That is, on certain instances like death, an inpatient hospitalization where they actually get treatment, not just observation, but you actually get treatment, an amputation of a digit or, a toe or a finger, and loss of an eye. Interesting, employers do not have to report an incident if it resulted, or motor vehicle accident, if it was on a public highway or street.
So
you don't have to call and report it. You don't have to call and report it unless it's in a construction zone.
But if this employee would have had one of those criterias and it was determined to be in the course and scope of employment, but on a public highway, would they need to report it?
No.
Okay.
They could have.
But it still could be OSHA recordable.
It's still OSHA recordable, right? Let's
be.
just say they lost an eye. They went through the windshield and they lost an eye and they were in the hospital. Normally that would be a reporting incident. You'd have to call and report it. But if you were just driving on a public highway, you wouldn't need to call and report it, but it would be an OSHA recordable, and it would also be a workers' comp claim, more than likely. Okay.
All right.
Very good.
So I think one of the last things we're going to talk about is the perspective from human resources. It's really important that your human resources, policies, and procedures are, lost my train of thought, that they're communicated to your employees. They want to know if those policies are going to have an impact on injury reporting, your attendance, your leave policies, discipline policies. What would be the ramifications in this case if they had a motor vehicle accident? Which of these apply?
Okay, so you have to have what really helps the company to have a very clear accident reporting procedure, right?
Yes.
So even if you're in the plant or you're driving and you've had an accident, there should be some clear procedure so your employee knows exactly who they're supposed to call or what phone number they're supposed to call and how they go about reporting it, right? And
you want to make sure that it specifies motor vehicle accidents apply. A lot of employees, just assume that only applies if you had an incident inside the job site or inside the plant.
And so let me ask this. What if they don't report it? What do you do then?
Well, and that's where the legal mind is going to necessarily be different from the human resources mind. There's always best practices.
Right.
But to your point, some people just don't report it. And you don't know what you don't know until an insurance company reaches out to you later.
Bingo.
But there should be.
How about this one?
Discipline policy.
I'm going to put you on the discipline. You hit it right on the head. I'm going to make this up as we're talking. I'm driving down the road and I will rear end somebody sitting at a stop sign. I talk to them and say, hey, look, you know what? This is really busy today. It's 5 o'clock. Let's just exchange insurance card information and everything. And here, you take a picture on your cell phone of my insurance card. I'll take a picture of your insurance card and we'll just go our way. And I don't call and report it because I've been drinking. And I don't want the cops or I don't want you guys telling me I have to go get a drug test.
Right.
And what happens?
Yeah, and unfortunately, I've come across that more times than I would like to. And the problem is, while you might think that we'll just get it fixed later, it goes back to some of the things we've talked about. You don't have the proof and that documentation, and there should be some disciplines if it's in your policy that an employee has to report it.
Exactly.
Because there could have been a situation where it wasn't minor or he was impaired, and you want to make sure that you're able to start that investigation sooner and know that.
Correct. It flows all through the organization.
Right.
Even if somebody's working in the plant on a machine or they're out on the road and they have an accident, they have to notify the proper people immediately or as soon as possible. And if they fail to do that, then they're subject to disciplinary action up to including termination from employment.
And it sets a precedent if you don't make certain people do it, but then you hold other people accountable for not doing it. So that's very important. You know, you let somebody slide by because he's a manager or supervisor, so, well, you don't have to report it, we'll just take care of it. But the next time their employee has the same situation, they're going to say, hey, the manager didn't have to do it, so I didn't think I had to do it. And it makes for some very tricky legal ground.
Oh, yeah, you set the company up for discrimination automatically.
And I think that's the problems that can arise, right? If you don't have consistency, you don't have good documentation, or you're showing discrimination or retaliation, those will be things that are hard to deal with. Something you have to keep in mind.
Before, you know, one last thing that we didn't touch on, but if somebody is off of work, they've got a workers' comp claim, they've had an auto accident, they reported everything timely, they're off of work, you have the right to run Family Medical Leave Act
Concurrent with the workers' compensation.
Workers' comp. And companies should do that.
Right.
We usually recommend they do that.
Right, because if they're off for 6 or 8 weeks for this work-related injury, for this motor vehicle accident, but you don't have them document it, then 6 weeks later, when they slip and fall at home and they have to be off for 12 more weeks,
exactly,
you don't have it documented, and they get to start their 12 weeks all over again.
Right. Okay, go ahead. Sorry about that. Just wanted to bring that.
So I think the last thing here is just kind of tying up some things we talked about earlier. From a human resources perspective, it's important to have your drug and alcohol policies. It's important to have your safety policies and fleet and vehicle policies. You want to make sure those expectations are out there so employees know, if I'm driving my own vehicle and I get into an accident, what do I need to do? If I'm in a company vehicle, what do I need to do? If I'm on a job site and I have any kind of accident, what do I need to do? Are the employees clear about the expectations and the consequences if they don't follow those procedures and policies?
Yep. Having clear policies, including distracted driving policies, accident reporting policies, drug testing, drug and alcohol testing policies, those are all important. And consistent follow through by management is extremely important. Otherwise, the company is being set up for a discrimination lawsuit.
Right.
I think that encapsulates pretty much everything we've talked about.
And then I think the final piece that you need to consider are your insurance issues. So if you've got a third-party carrier or an insurance carrier that's looking at the auto insurance portion of it, looking at who repairs the vehicles, who's going to pay the medical bills, it's really important that you know what your insurance requirements are, because they may be different than what your company policies are. So, for example, if you work at a company and you don't require drug testing or you don't require incident reports, but then you turn around and file a claim with your insurance carrier, they may be inclined to not pay the claim and deny the claim because there isn't appropriate documentation to show liability.
That is a great point. Insurance companies, we'll go back to the words we used earlier, insurance companies will require their clients that would be your company, to perform due diligence in going through and investigating these accidents. And if a company hasn't done that, as far as the insurance carrier is concerned, you haven't complied with the terms and conditions of the insurance policy.
Right.
So they're not going to provide coverage.
Right. And I've come across cases where there was not documentation and the carrier said, well, we can't cover this because we have no proof there was an auto accident. We have no proof that this damage came from it. The information didn't jive. And that can cause a lot of trouble, especially if you thought, oh, well, we'll get subrogation and we'll be good to go. I've had more than one time where we hit somebody, didn't document it. They came back with a totally different vehicle, severe injuries now as a result of this, and the insurance carrier paid on a claim that, in our opinion, wasn't valid. But we had no information to the contrary.
Well, let's talk about something before we're almost done. So we've got, I think this might be the last slide. Insurance policies. If you're an employer and you have employees driving all over the place in their own personal vehicles, do you require proof of insurance as the employer?
In my opinion, you should. You should not have employees driving company vehicles for sure without having the appropriate licensure, certifications, and in my opinion, you should be checking that annually. If they're driving their own personal vehicle for company business, I think the same rules should apply. However, I do know not every company has that, but that is the best practice.
Right, it is the best practice.
And not so much that you want to have overburdensome requirements, but it really comes back to liability. If your employee is driving a third-party vehicle, and I've had this happen, and they get into an accident after work hours, well, they tell that person they hit, yeah, I'm driving home from work. So that insurance company files a claim against ABC company when their employee was not even in the course and scope of employment.
Right.
So at least if you know your drivers are insured and that they meet the qualifications, then I think that will help. It's not going to fix every problem, but it is due diligence.
Exactly. So that does require some time and effort by human resource and safety people to coordinate all the different issues we've talked about today: insurance coverage, safety policies, employment handbook, workers' compensation.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things to consider if somebody's involved in a motor vehicle accident. And again, reach out to your attorneys or your third-party administrators if you're not sure what that best practice is. You know, go back to the drawing boards and try to develop that. Use that information and make your next handbook update a little more robust.
Very good. Do we have any questions, Carrie?
So far, we don't have any questions, but there was a comment with regard to the subrogation. It says, state-funded employers have the right to file the AC-28 in which they request that the claim be charged to the surplus fund for not-at-fault accidents. However, thorough investigation needs to be done, such as the at-fault driver insurance, if they were ticketed, et cetera.
Yes.
Good point.
That flows right along with what we were talking about. You have to do a thorough investigation and in order to seek subrogation, because subrogation it's something you have to work for.
Mm-hmm. And not every insurance carrier has the same criteria for when they will subrogate. So again, it's important to know who your carriers are, and if it's a workers' compensation claim and you're state funded and the Bureau of Workers' Comp is involved, they may get their own investigators involved to do their own investigation outside of what you might do from a company perspective. So that's something you have to take into consideration.
Yeah.
Work with those other parties. That's another one of those specialists that might get involved. And what you thought would be a simple motor vehicle accident isn't simple anymore.
Right. Well, we will be doing a more robust version of this down in Columbus. Denise and I will be at Safety Congress, which is a 3-day safety exposition training, wonderful group of people talking down there, and that's in March, or?
Yeah, a lot of really good information, different speakers, ranging topics from medical to safety to workers' compensation, insurance,
Human resource even.
OSHA,
Yeah.
wide range of topics and speakers.
So we would encourage everyone not just to come to our presentation, but if you have the opportunity to attend Safety Congress down in Columbus in March, please do so. And otherwise, you have our contact information. Please feel free to contact us.
If you have any questions or comments or suggestions.
Right. But otherwise, I guess we'll sign off. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.